You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Katja. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Rachel Land as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
So we are back and we have Diane Malaspina with us back on the show. She's been on here multiple times before. She is an applied psychologist and a yoga teacher. She holds a PhD in developmental and educational psychology, and she loves to blend in neurobiology and psychology science with yoga practice and with mindfulness practices. And we are going to dive right into some of those blends in today's episode. So we're so happy to have you, Diane. Welcome back on here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we should talk about what we're actually talking about today. So the title of this episode is Finding Your Drishti. And in yoga, we typically refer to Drishti, like of that concept of focusing your gaze on a certain point, maybe the tip of your nose or some spot in the room or your third eye or so. So that's more the kind of literal aspect of Drishti in the yoga practice. Today, though, we want to take a bit of a broader perspective on gaze, on the visual system in general, and how the visual system relates also to our autonomic nervous system, how we might work actively with our vision to influence our emotional state potentially. And of course, we're going to chat plenty how you can incorporate that or those themes into your yoga practice and into your daily life. And play with that and experiment with that. So I'm very excited about that one. And Diane, why don't we kick it off by maybe mentioning or talking a little bit about why the visual system is interesting for us humans at all.
Yeah, so I think what we think of, especially as yoga teachers and yoga practitioners, is that the breath is the main conduit to our nervous system in terms of either bringing on more arousal or calming us down. But what we don't always know right offhand is that our five senses, and in particular our vision and our visual system, is one of the strongest levers that we can use to influence the state of our body and our mind. So during our conversation today, we're going to highlight some of the ways that our visual system can impact our autonomic nervous system in terms of either arousing us or bringing us into action, or in a more calming way that helps us soothe us and ease any tension that we may be feeling.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So we're going to talk about our visual system as a gateway into the nervous system. And I mean, also it's a gateway to our environment, right? So we see the world, we perceive the world. And to set the stage, I want to just briefly talk a little bit about two terms that we typically kind of use interchangeably: sight and vision. At least in my experience, I use those terms sometimes interchangeably, but they really are not. So when we talk about sight, that's actually more related to the anatomy or the physiology of seeing. So imagine you have something in front of you, a visual stimulus, a cup. I have a cup in front of me, so I'm going to talk about my cup. And sight is going to be about how we produce a clear image of that cup, how our eyes and all the anatomy related to that is going to produce a clear image. And then vision is actually more about the perception of what we see. So of my cup in that case, it's about interpreting that clear image that my eye has produced. So I have to learn how I use my two eyes together to create like that 3D view. And then I have to interpret what I see. So if I have never seen a cup in my life, my mind won't know it's a cup. So I do like I do like that saying that goes, the eye cannot see, but the mind hasn't learned. So those two really go together. Or if we go a step further, we cannot really exchange or separate eyes and nervous system, eyes and central nervous system to be specific at all. Can we, Diane?
No, we can't. In fact, again, what a lot of us don't know about our own bodies is that our eyes are actually a part of our central nervous system. The neural retina, which is in the back of the eyes, which senses light, are actually a part of our brain that are outside of the skull cap. So this has a large impact in terms of our state of mind and how we view the world, very much based on what you were just sharing, right? The sensation is the light coming in through the eye. The perception is how we process it or how we make meaning of it. And so given that the eyes are actually two pieces of the brain that are not connected to the brain, they actually are the brain. During prenatal development, what happens is that the eyes are kind of forced out through the skull cap during embryonic development. And as the eyes get extruded from the skull during that first trimester, they reconnect to the rest of the brain. And so that makes them directly connected to the central nervous system. Because if you remember from your physiology classes, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So having the eyes outside of the skull orients us to the time of day, and it's linked to our circadian rhythm. And again, a lot of us study or hear about circadian rhythm, and it's very important to our overall functioning because it helps determine our responsiveness to daylight, and it gives us internal signals not only for sleep, which is really important. So we regulate based on the incoming sensation of light, and then we use that incoming sensation and perceive it to give us a sense of homeostasis in terms of when we should be awake and when we should be sleeping. That also has an impact on a variety of other internal processes like our metabolism. So the visual system really has a key role in not only our levels of arousal, but also our metabolic activity, and that adjusts our inner state to meet the needs of the environment.
Yeah, it's probably like way more extensive than what you think at first when you hear your sight or your eyes. It just goes so much beyond that. And frankly, like when I think about my eyes to be an actual part of my brain, it's kind of, I mean, it's fascinating. It's also a bit weird. It also makes me understand a bit better why my kid's doctor is always quite nervous when you have like a more severe eye infection, which, I mean, with that connection, it just totally makes sense. But you really have to visualize that first, kind of. Yeah, I think it's something that sticks in your head once you visualize that one. Totally. Yeah. So
Yeah.
So so our eye is really as a part of the central nervous system of our brains. I mean, we see our world with our eyes, and we tend to take that seriously, right? Like we tend to take that for the truth and for granted. It's one of the gateways out into the world and how we perceive our environment. What I find fascinating, and that also is like a little bit setting the stage for what's about to come, and maybe put things into a relative context, is that what we take for granted, what we take for the truth, is not always the case, right? So I already talked a little bit about that inference that we make of what we see, like a little bit of a guess of the world. And I just wanted to share two little tidbits or two things that I also find fascinating about the visual system, because it's not always that clear what we see. One of those things is something we call change blindness. So I don't know, Diane, if you've ever done those puzzles as a kid where you have two pictures and then you have to find the differences between the two. So there's like typically 3 or 5 things that have changed. my son, who's 5 years old, he's just starting to do these, and I find it ridiculously funny how long it sometimes takes me. I haven't done these for a while, to do those simple kids puzzles, to find those differences, if I find them at all. He tends to be better at this. And what it tells us is, or what that is an example of, is that we sometimes don't see what is right in front of us, but what was in front of us. So we have more, the first picture is more present in our mind, and the second picture that's presented, where the changes have happened, it's just so much harder to see the actual change in there. So it's so much about what we expect or what we have kind of stored. And that's one aspect. What I find interesting about perception, it's about the expectation, what's there, and we are sometimes not as sensitive to change, right?
Yeah, in psychology and really in neuroscience, there's a term called pattern recognition system, and it's the idea that what you interpret is based on previous experience, based on the pattern that you've recognized before. So it might be interesting to see if your son is a little bit quicker at the activity because he might be spending more time with it and, really indulging himself in the activity of looking at the two pictures, whereas adults don't do that as often, right? So for you, your pattern recognition might be from a long time ago of doing an exercise like that. And it really influences the ease at which you're able to dive into that activity. And I just think it really attunes to like how our expectations, whether it's a conditioned expectation based on neural activity, or it's an experiential conditioning where it's like there's this memory of, oh, this was this way before, right? However we label it, both are happening at the same time and have an impact on what we see. So it's really fascinating. It's like two people, as your experience is saying, could be looking at the same exact thing and have a different ease with which they see it or experience with which they see it.
Yeah, that's definitely like one of those aspects where we're sometimes wondering, right? Two people see the same thing. Do they really see the same thing? And then one more experiment that some listeners might be familiar with, I'm quite sure that you're familiar with it from your psychology studies, is an experiment by Dan Simons. It's been a couple years ago. And if you know it, or if you, let's put it that way, I'm going to give away the fun of this one. But if you don't know it yet, make your family members or a friend watch it and then see if it works. It's about a basketball passing game. So it's a video. You can put that into your search engine. And you see people throwing a basketball back and forth. Some of them are in a white jersey and some of them are in a black jersey. And I believe you're supposed to count the passes between the people in the white jerseys. And then in the middle of the video, someone in a gorilla costumes walks into the screen, waves at you, and walks back out of the screen again. So, I mean, you would think that a gorilla in the screen is something that your visual system notices, and he's not subtle about it. It's just an actual gorilla costumed person in the middle of the screen. But most people miss that person in the gorilla costume because they're so focused on the people in the white jerseys passing the ball back and forth. So we are focusing on what we're thinking is going to happen in that scene. It's a basketball game, and we're focused on the task at hand. And we totally miss something very, very obvious in front of us. And that is just, to me, a very, very good reminder that we are so conditioned, or maybe our visual system just works that way, to what our expectation is of that scene, of that context that we experience. And maybe we shouldn't always take so granted for what we take to be our own truth, because clearly our sensory system has some sort of bias there, right?
Absolutely. Going back to kind of that task, at hand. So if the aim is to like count as many and you're given a cognitive task, right? It's going to be, as much as the eyes might be drawing in the perception of somebody waving their hand, a gorilla waving their hands at you. The reality is that the focus is on counting the number of passes. And so what happens is that the eyes are taking in the information, but they're not perceiving it as threat, maybe, especially because it's like a friendly little wave or something like that. And so the individual is able to maintain their focus on counting the passes versus being able to have to also process what's happening with the gorilla. And that's where they're using the power of their frontal lobe, in a sense, to override what's happening in the environment. I mean, think about it. If we took in all of the information that crosses in front of our visual field, our minds would be a state of chaos because there's so much coming in and we have to selectively attend, which is where I think the yoga practices, we can get really good at selectively attending both what's happening outside in the world and then internally, on what it is that we choose to perceive. And then we also then want to remember that those perceptions, the way that we process it, is highly determined on past experience. So it may not be truth, or it might just be individual truth with many truths, right, out there.
Yeah, you're totally right that it would be a total overwhelm in our system if we took everything in. That's also a good relating that experiment to that also is so true or so valuable to think about it that way. It just wouldn't work if we would take in every little thing that we see. Would be a lot for our heads, right? Yeah. And then also just one last little bit on that, an extension or alteration of that experiment, which I also found quite interesting, was that they presented a CT, so a computer tomography image, to radiologists, and they actually also put like a tiny gorilla picture on that. So they pasted that gorilla picture on the CT image and just asked radiologists to scan the image like they typically do. And most radiologists also missed the gorilla in that context because they're typically looking at like a white roundish shape because that would represent a tumor. And obviously they are not looking for black gorillas in an image, but they're trained to look at those white roundish, smaller shapes because they would be clinically relevant. And again, I mean, if they would probably notice every little difference in shade or form, it would overwhelm them and probably take them forever to look at the picture. And also, they're trained to do that. But I find those two examples just very, very strong examples that our systems are primed and we are focusing on certain aspects of the environment, and that then becomes our truth, and there's a certain filter to that probably and a certain interpretation to that. And I just think we should never forget that when we talk about vision. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but as you pointed out, my brain needs to do that in order to not get lost in the magnitude of information out there, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'd be quite confused.
Yeah. And I mean, confusion is not what we want. We want to focus. We want to know what we tend to with our vision, with our brains. And one way the nervous system does that is by means of our autonomic nervous system, right? It needs to tell us whether we need to be interested in something, whether we need to be aroused, whether we need to focus on that very intensely, or whether we can relax, and whether we assess if a situation is safe and we can lay back and everything's okay. And of course, the visual system also relates to that, as you've already pointed out a little bit. Could you elaborate on that a little bit further?
Sure. So our eyes, just like all of our other sense organs, have two roles. The first is to detect the environment in terms of shape, color, brightness, depth, any of the other sensory information that's coming in, again, to be processed. But the second role is to communicate to the brain whether or not to be more alert or more relaxed. That's our threat detection system, in a sense, right? And that's where we tie that into the nervous system. So the eyes can register events in the environment at a distance to adjust the overall state of alertness in the rest of the brain and the body. So we can sit here and be on a computer or reading a book or looking at our phones, and we can adjust our visual field so that it's up close. But we also have the ability to look up from what's right in front of us and scan out into the distance. And again, that's a survival or a safety mechanism, because that way, if there were something in the distance that might be of threat to us, we would be able to have some sort of response that enhances our survival, such as fighting or fleeing, right? So we don't have to wait until it's like up close and personal to prepare us for fight and flight. When we take a step back and look at the general responses of our autonomic nervous system, that parasympathetic nervous system that's related more to our relaxation state, and the sympathetic nervous system related more to our arousal state, there is a continual tuning of our pupil size, along with a continual tuning of our heart rate and our breath rate. So just keep in mind that these things are all happening simultaneously. And this tuning of these different parts of our functioning is regulating this arousal activity to either allow us to rest and digest, or to promote a state that will allow us to fight or flee. Or it doesn't even have to be that extreme. Like sympathetic nervous system arousal is also related to like focusing deeply, right? So specifically what the eyes do is the muscles respond by dictating the size of the pupil to regulate the amount of light that's coming in through the eye. And when we're in a state of arousal or a state of distress, the pupils enlarge to take in more light. And when we're in a state of relaxation, our pupils constrict to limit the amount of light. And basically, and this has been researched in many different fields, but in the field of psychology, the pupil size is going to increase in proportion to the difficulty of task at hand. And there's this interesting book written by a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, that talks about the different roles that the eyes have in relation to how we respond in our thinking. So the thinking fast is going to be more of that sympathetic nervous system arousal that is not really thinking, but is like moving us into action. And then the thinking slow is like when we're in more of that parasympathetic or relaxed state, we can use more of our frontal lobe and get into like more readily into like decision making and things like that. But the one thing I want to say is, just like with everything else, it's not one or the other. Obviously, both are usually operating to some extent, and one is just usually more prevalent. So if we're facing threat, though, or perceiving that we're facing threat through what's coming in through our eyes and connecting that to past experience, we're going to have an autonomic nervous system response that sets us into action.
So you started off that explanation by mentioning that we're sometimes sitting in front of the computer or in front of a screen. And I mean, we have the ability to look up and look at, like, take everything in, take more of a peripheral view in. But let's say we don't do that because we're so focused on our computer work. Is it fair to say that if I look at my screen, like very, very focused way without looking up for a very long time, that my nervous system is kind of missing that info? Is if the predator is coming around the corner, evolutionarily speaking, and I cannot judge whether I'm in danger or not because I'm so focused, and that also contributes to, for instance, the stress I'm feeling after a long day of work. Is that too far-fetched?
No, I would say, and it exactly relates to the experiment you talked about with counting the balls that are being passed and the gorilla coming out and not seeing the gorilla. And the same thing with the radiologist who's like focused in on looking for something specific. Or when you're looking at, those little games with your son, right? when you're focused and you're intent on something, there is sympathetic nervous system arousal. In fact, the dopamine receptors are receiving inputs of dopamine, which are helping us track something, which keep us like very alert and onto something. And yes, that can easily, especially if it's in the up close, cause us to miss what's in the distance or what's in the periphery in terms of threat detection. And the other thing, and this will come up in a few moments in our conversation, but especially when talking about looking at your phone or your computer all day, right, and having that intense focus, there's usually typically the way the nerves route in terms of the nerves that not only determine the movement of our eyes and the dilation of our pupils as a mechanism of what we're talking about, but there's a system-wide effect where the musculature, especially in our upper body, is tensing up. And we're probably sitting in a position where we're not getting a lot of movement. So we're also getting, some tissue adaptation, which kind of keeps us stuck in that position a little bit, right? And so what you might start to pay attention to is that if you are looking at your computer all day long and maybe it's something you're excited about, so there might be it doesn't have to be negative stress, it could be something that's just arousing and interesting, fascinating, but you're likely holding tension in your neck. You're likely, if you stop, you might have tension in your jaw and your tongue. All of those muscle responses and tissue responses are also responding to the stimulation of what you're bringing in through your eyes. So the stress that you also feel at the end of the day might just be from holding that level of focus and arousal for a period of time where now the system, because we desire to go back into some level of equilibrium, right? The system has been pushing a sympathetic mode for an extended period of time. And then you log off your computer and you're like, okay, I need to be able to exhale and release some of that, right? So
Yeah, so kind of gazing out of the window or even just taking a look around the office or wherever you're sitting, and that will be point A then, to just consciously defocus your gaze, and then also of course taking in that little internal assessment of your posture, of your breath, of your alignment there, of your head over your thorax or your torso. That would be a nice thing to do. That's what I take from what you're explaining there. Something I definitely should do more often.
Yeah. So for some people out here that listen know that I do some performance coaching. And one of the strategies that we actually recommend is regular breaks where you either engage in wall staring because there's less stimulation coming in through the eyes, right? And that's going to settle the nervous system. Or one of my favorites is to go outside and take in a more panoramic point of view. So one of the things I love to do is lay on my back and look up at the clouds, right? Because it's far away and you can take in your vision, or you look outside and you take in the panorama of the horizon wherever you're looking. So when we're in that sympathetic focus, right, and we're looking at the screen, the eyeballs are actually orienting more towards center. They're constricting, almost like you think of something that has blinders on, right? It keeps you from that peripheral view. Again, for back in the development of this, the intention was for some sort of survival mechanism, or at least a threat detection mechanism. And so now what turns that on is our technological advances and our work habits. And so in order to keep it balanced, we can intentionally take those breaks and look at a wall or look at the horizon, or what we'll talk about, move our eyes in different ways that keep or alleviate the need to feel focused and the muscular tension that's involved in that, which will send different messages to the brain and the body.
The wall staring is definitely something I haven't tried out before. I will for sure experiment with that one. Makes total sense to me, but have never tried it. What I have heard of before is, as you were mentioning, like more of that peripheral view or more of that panoramic view that we know from studies that when you are driving, there's quite a lot of studies on driving and vision, which makes sense. That when you are in a stressed out situation or when you're anxious because, for instance, you're driving in a new environment, you tend to have more of that tunnel vision. So you are not able to interpret and take in that peripheral or more panoramic visual cues, and you don't work with that or don't interpret that as much. So you have more of that tunnel vision, and also generally under higher cognitive load or even just under loud music. And I mean, that maybe many are familiar with that one, like when you are driving and you need to focus more and you need to really pay attention to what's happening, not only in front of you, but all around you, you tend to put the music down again, like when you're parking into a complicated spot or so. Many people, I think, tend to dial the music down. I at least do. So that's also an interesting observation that maybe some of the listeners are aware of or get to be aware of as we were talking about that one. So that's like something you experience in driving, but as you mentioned, also something that we can deliberately put into practice, like the wall staring or the cloud watching. And just, I guess, just being or becoming aware of that is the first step, by maybe, I don't know, having a reminder on your phone or something that pops up every couple minutes during your workday. Or how are there any recommendations you have for that one?
Yeah, I love that you're asking me about this, because this is one of my most favorite things to talk about. So I talked about circadian rhythms earlier, but there's actually also part of our biology which is called ultradian rhythms. And I don't know if you've studied that, Katja, in your work, but ultradian rhythms are basically, ultra means within the course of the 24 hours. And so there's obviously a lot of biorhythms that we have happening within us that occur within that circadian, within the course of a day. And one of them is this sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, the way that it waves up and down throughout a day. So it's not natural for us. Look at any other mammal. If you just observe them, it's not natural for them to go 8 hours straight, like, throttling into their work with like their energy and their focus. In fact, it's almost impossible. We all could admit that even though we might be working for 8 hours, our focus is not its best for that full 8 hours. And so the ultradian rhythm is really ebbing and flowing with your natural rhythm in taking breaks. And so the idea is that as stress spikes, as you kind of go up the curve, which is focus, again, it could be something exciting. Stress doesn't have to be negative, but it's something like as you are using your internal resources in order to operate on something, let's say in the work world, or as a parent, like as you're focusing on your children or whatever it is that you're doing with your time, that you get to a peak at around the 90-minute mark where you're naturally going to start to lose energy. And what we often do, because we're told that we're supposed to do this, is we try to push through it, right? And that's going to get us into, if you go back to Seeley's work and the stress response, if we take sort of that arousal level and we keep pushing it, we resist the urge to take rest, we eventually get into exhaustion, right? So if we are good humans, what we do is we follow the ultradian rhythm, and roughly every 90 minutes, we take a 15-minute break, which means that we decrease stimulation, particularly if we're looking at a screen. We decrease that stimulation. We look at a wall. We take in a panoramic view. And everything as it works in the autonomic nervous system, everything that excites the nervous system and the responses, increased heart rate, increased breath rate, pupil dilation, we do the opposite to bring us down into parasympathetic. So we slow the breath, the heart rate then slows. And if we take in a broader point of view outside of that tunnel vision that you were just describing, so if we allow the tunnel to open and we take in more of a perspective, we can bring about some activity in the parasympathetic nervous system. And we just need about 15 minutes of that. And I would say start with 5 if you're really busy, but start with cycling in these little moments of lack of stimulation so that the nervous system can go into a more parasympathetic state. And then you can ride the wave back up into sympathetic arousal as you get back into what you're doing. And the research resoundingly shows that productivity is higher because you're, by the end of the day, if you're trying to push yourself, your cognitive load is like zapped. Like your work is not its best if you've been pushing yourself mentally all day. But the research supports that if you take those breaks along this rhythm, you actually produce well in a shorter amount of time. You get more done in a better way.
And I would assume, I don't know if that's right, but I would assume that it's not only about an increase in productivity, but also if I haven't been like hiking up sympathetic mountain all day, it's probably also going to be easier to come down. And in the context of the overall circadian rhythm of that day, probably also easier to come down at night and find better into sleep, or that would probably play into sleep as well, I can only assume.
Everything plays into everything. Like, yes, definitely sleep, because sleep is part of that rhythm. And if you look at, the stages of sleep, they're following a rhythm as well. There's little bits of alertness that are happening in a sleep cycle. And if you track your sleep, you'll see those waves. And they're happening around 90 minutes. And so it's all the same thing. It just has different sort of names at different phases of our day. And you're right. I mean, it'll impact hormonal health. It'll impact digestive health. It'll impact cardiac health. I mean, there's like a variety of things because this nervous system, we have to speak about it in a reductionist way because it's so complex. But if we understand the holistic nature of it and we start doing things, especially with our eyes, which our eyes, given that our eyes are like our strongest function, given that we don't have any challenges there, our eyes are working really hard and we rely on them a lot as humans and as mammals. And so it's like giving ourselves the opportunity to use them as a tool for settling ourselves, which we can do in the yoga practice as well.
Yeah,
intentionally.
So I just love that idea of working more intently with our eyes. I certainly have that intention all the time, and I just don't do it as much as I would like to do. I've learned about wall watching already today, which is a new one for me. We've talked about cloud gazing, which I try to do sometimes. What else could we do? I know that you also are very familiar with eye movements per se and how they relate to our overall emotional state. And then you already kind of referenced a bit to that, or spoke to that a little bit, that it's about our posture, about how we set up our head, our neck over our thorax and torso. It's a whole complex in itself, more from an alignment point of view. Could you speak to that a little bit as well?
Sure. So I'll start with like just from a yoga perspective, like when we're on our mats and how we could, guide others as teachers, but that we could also in our own life, like when we take these little breaks or when we're doing our own practice, how we can incorporate it. So, I think a lot about, we take this kind of like hard vision, this tunnel vision onto our mats a lot of the time. Like we're watching really hard what the teacher's doing, or if we're watching it online, we're trying to get it right. And I remember one of my favorite cues as a student was when the teacher would offer to soften the gaze, right? And so like just knowing that you can like bring awareness to the energy that you're bringing into how you're looking at things, that alone can be a huge shift and a huge awareness. So like softening the gaze and then, possibly working with Drishti. My understanding of Drishti was that it was a steady gaze, but it was almost like an unfocused focused, steady gaze. You don't harden the eyes to work with a drishti. So for some of you out there that are newer to yoga, the concept of drishti is locking the gaze on something, but with a softened gaze, almost that it has a blur to it. So in some movements, it's the tip of the nose. In some movements, you use hand mudras and you look at the fingers. And sometimes it's not even as specific as that. It might just be like gaze forward at the top of the mat, right? So the gaze can often, again, be hard because of what our life entails. And so we might bring that to the mat. And so we can use something like relaxing around the eyes, softening the gaze, using a sense of blurred vision at looking at things, closing the eyes at times. And then I offered in the mental health module for yoga medicine just to explore with the eye movement, kind of the eye clock, where you can start with looking all the way up and looking all the way down. And when you're not used to doing that, it feels like work for the eye muscles. And then you can, look all the way to the right and all the way to the left. And then you can take your eyes in a full circle, both clockwise and counterclockwise. And then some people like to rub their hands and heat the hands and cup the eyes. And if anything, it tends to be very stress relieving after we do that. And I think I've never seen like a actual research paper on it, but there's something to support just anecdotally that it makes us feel good and it kind of feels soothing. So that's something that we can do. And then in terms of, thinking also about like even where a teacher is placed in the room and moving around the room and maybe being like at a distant, a little bit from certain mats. And then, when we come in close, the impact that can have on people's perceptions with their visual field. So those I think are some other ways to think about it. And then in terms of like how that might relate to, the downflow in the rest of the body, again, so the cranial nerves are the nerves that route out of the base of the skull, and they are nerves that do not route through the spine, other than there is a bundle of nerves in the sacrum that are not cranial nerves, they're sacral nerves, but both the cranial nerves and the sacral nerves are mostly parasympathetic, relaxation-based nerve routes. And then there are sympathetic-based nerves, arousing-based nerves that mostly route through our spines. And the cranial nerves mostly route into our face. And in particular, the vagus nerve, which is our most famous nerve because it's big and it gets a lot of publicity for, helping us with our nervous system, which it does. That vagus nerve has two routes. It routes into our face and into our muscles around our eyes and into our facial muscles for expression. And it also routes into our body through all of our major organs. And in particular, it runs through our lungs, our diaphragm, and our digestive tract. And so where we can think about this from the yoga practice is that we can, again, soften the face and soften the gaze when we think about the routes that are happening above the neck. And when we think about the routes that are happening below, we know that, like, for example, using the breath can have an influence on calming the nervous system via the vagus nerve. And so the way that I think about it, just to keep it simple, is that when we're in an aroused state, there is an associated response, like I mentioned before. Not only might our eyes harden and get into tunnel vision, but we're also likely to tense the muscles in the face. We're also likely to tense the tongue. And I've heard some people talk about how when you tense the tongue, that creates kind of an internal tensing of the deeper tissues. I don't know how valid that is. But then we also posture in certain ways, which again have that effect of, if we posture that way enough, we kind of create almost like a little mold that feels kind of stuck, and we lose that hydration and that ability to move more fluidly. And so the association with it all is that we can use, there's lots of gateways. There's the breath. There's, talking, just calling out, cueing and working with body awareness and scanning and relaxing the muscles or working with our posture. But we can also take the approach from the eyes, and we could take in panoramic vision, or we could close the eyes, or we could link, looking at a blank wall with a slow breath, and that could really enhance that response. So there's a variety of ways that you could work with that. And just remember, it's all connected. So you could pick your pathway there.
Yeah, and it's really fun to experiment with that. Just a couple of more ideas I like to play also in the yoga practice. You've mentioned many of them, like the clockwise viewing, or then also more specifically than just the teacher in the room, like those focusing on something that's near versus far. It's something that I always love to do. And I have recently taken a couple of classes that played with connecting vision and breath. So playing with more of a panoramic vision as you exhale, and then more of a focused vision as you inhale, kind of bringing those two together. I think that's also just interesting aspects to connect two of those pathways in the very complex system. That's interesting. And then one thing I also like to do, it feels weird, honestly. I have two kids. I don't get to take many classes at studios these days, so I really like every once in a while to take online classes when I don't focus on my own practice. I really like that, but I'm challenging myself every now and then to just listen and not look at the video, and it makes me I can notice the impact on my vision. Like I'm searching for something because I'm so used to either looking at a teacher or looking at a screen when I'm taking a guided practice. And it's just really interesting also to notice your own vision and to play around with it when you take a guided practice, but you have no visual anchor you tie yourself to. It's also something that I like to do every once in a while. I think it can be a tool, kind of a self-reflective tool about what's happening to your vision when you don't focus on the teacher or the iPad in front of you or so. Just also
I love that.
some ideas to play with that a little bit. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And I'll add, for those of you that are interested in, a little bit more on that, there's a book called Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve by Stanley Rosenberg. And I'm seeing a little bit of this out in the health and wellness press lately. So some of you might see this as well, but he talks about, this is his theory. I'm kind of, just summing up for you, but he talks about, he's a body worker, and he talks about how there's a direct neurological connection between the 8 suboccipital muscles and the muscles that move our eyes. And his theory is that when we're under high alert, these suboccipital muscles become tense, and they actually subluxate our first 2 cervical vertebrae, C1 and C2, which then decreases blood flow to the head as well as the vagus nerve, the routing of the vagus nerve that goes up into the head. So he also speaks to like using myofascial release. And I play, again, I just use it experimentally with that. So like often a lot of the things that we use at yoga medicine, like taking the edge of the block behind the neck and that suboccipital region, and, doing a little bit of myofascial release, and like, also working with posture, just cueing posture in poses like cobra pose, right? Where sometimes we tend to really like jut the chin forward, and how we can like cue the gaze in something like a back bend that we do on our belly, but we could also think about cueing the alignment of the chin and the neck. Because his theory, Rosenberg's theory, is that we're like the forward head carriage is creating more of that sympathetic nervous system arousal, because we're not getting the stimulation from the nerves and the blood flow in the upper body as we need it. So it's something to consider in terms of how we use it. And there's vision, and then there's awareness, which is another way of seeing the world, right?
Yeah, just to add to that one, I also like the myofascial release, of course, in the back of the head. And then just for teachers who are listening to this, maybe just some cues to play around with. I always like to use the cue that people are like bringing their awareness to the back of their head, to the hairline there, and then imagining that some sunlight is shining from the back onto like that hairline, and they kind of bring the back of their neck up towards that sunlight, and thereby like bringing in the chin. That's not a people don't take that as a too sexy cue, I guess, to create a little bit of that double chin, which is healthy for that forward head posture. But the sun in the back seems to be a bit more, yeah,
I love that.
attractive.
That's poetic. Yeah, it's
Bit
very
more
poetic.
more so than the double chin, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. I had a physical therapist tell me too, and this would have to be verified by like a physical therapist or somebody who knows this better than I do, but related to gaze, that when you're moving, when you're exercising and whatever you're doing, whether it's yoga or lifting weights or whatever you want to be doing, not to look down, because when you look down, you're inhibiting what she calls, I want to say she calls it it's a reflex related to extent. I think she calls it the extension reflex. I'm not sure if I'm absolutely correct on the wording, but the idea is that when we look down in our movement, like if we're walking or if we're, again, doing yoga or weightlifting, that actually creates a blockage in our posture and in our tissue flow. And so it's like to either look forward or even to look slightly up so that we get the extension. And she's relating that to some sort of reflex that we have. So it's interesting.
Definitely something to take into consideration in your body awareness. And you also mentioned a little bit when it comes to body awareness and to posture, that it's not only about the neck and not only about your eyes per se, but it starts much lower, right? So it's also worth taking into consideration the position of your thorax over your legs or torso generally, and then your ribs, and like the whole chain from low to high, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for those of you that are looking for, there's a couple of exercises. They're called the salamander exercises, and they're kind of yoga-ish a little bit. And they're basically, I will just advise you to do a little search on it. But basically, it combines eye movement with body movement, with head movement, and with thoracic movement, really. And so it's an interesting take on, and the point of it is to access the vagus nerve, is to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system by moving the eyes in an extreme direction and then also releasing the musculature in the neck and in the spine. So you can check that out and see if that works for you as well. They're called half salamander and salamander exercises.
Sounds good. And I think having taken a look at that, it's something that we sometimes automatically do, or some of us include in their practice. I always love these things when you kind of have them in your repertoire already, and then they make even more sense as they relate to a new concept like that one. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about how we could, during the day, maybe help our visual system to connect more, or come more into that parasympathetic state. We've chatted a little bit how in yoga we can use some of that blurred focused vision. We can do certain specific eye exercises, like looking around the clock or far and nearsighted stuff. We could use the salamander exercises, where you use like extreme view into one direction with a couple of movements of the neck or the spine. What else? Is there anything else that you love to practice with your eyes specifically? Or is that kind of like, are those your favorite tools? Or is there anything else you have in mind?
Well, I do think I think that, balance is good for focus. I think, at the same time, we can talk about how the practice can also like gear us up if we're feeling on the lethargic side, right? How the visual field, we tend to sometimes just think about how do we release stress? How do we, like, but then there's the other side, like how do we step into motivation? How do we, enliven ourselves when we're trying to meet the demands of something and we might not feel like we have the tools to get there. When you balance, obviously darting the eyes around isn't helpful for balance. So finding a steady gazing point can be really great for focus. Another one that I've shared with the yoga medicine community is candle gazing as a meditation technique. So sometimes open-eyed meditation techniques, again, they might turn on a little bit of that sympathetic nervous system activity, but they can train, you can use them as a training for focusing the mind and actually eventually focusing on something else that you want to pursue in your life. So I would say those are balance poses and some staring techniques to kind of give you a little energy can be helpful too.
And
What about you? What do you think?
One of the very, very obvious ones is just in Shavasana. I sometimes like to take notice if the eye is still working. So if sometimes you notice that you still see like little lights or your eyeballs are still moving, and then just very simple, as all of us have probably done, just using an eye pillow, but very consciously using it and just consciously relaxing my eyeballs. So I think that's, just like in the standard yoga toolbox, but I find that to be so relaxing for my eyes. I do a little bit of breath work each night that is a bit more down regulating, and I do that in a dark room. But even though I'm doing it in a dark room, I just like using an eye pillow on top of that to give my eyes a bit more of that heaviness, to induce relaxation on a muscular level. So even in a dark room, I like to use my eye pillow. I like that
I
one.
like that. That's nice. That sounds really, and then same thing with people who like to wear an eye mask when they sleep, just to kind of block out, the extra sensory information. Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah. There's actually one more thing I wanted to, point to, or one study that we will also link in the show notes, because it's a question that comes up oftentimes in yoga teacher trainings, actually, when we talk about our sensory experience, when we talk about the eyes. At least I have gotten that question several times, about pressure, interocular pressure, if that's a thing, if that is something to be aware of. And as there is a specific study on that related to yoga poses, I just wanted to share that because it's always nice to back up what we feel in our bodies anyway, or what we're practicing anyway, with some of the science. So there is a study by, I have to look that one up, Jazian, I believe it's pronounced, from 2015. And they looked at glaucoma patients and compared that with people who did not have glaucoma. So people, or if you're not aware what that is, it's a eye disease that leads to blindness eventually. It's a progressive disease, so you lose a little bit of your visual field at first, and then that progresses. And one of the things that you should really avoid, because it's a risk factor in the symptoms of that, is interocular pressure. And maybe you have felt that one when you have practiced some sort of inversions. So that's the context we're typically talking about intraocular pressure. And that study I'm referring to looked at 4 inversions, which was down dog, then uttanasana, so standing forward fold, halasana, so plow pose, and then viparita karani, so legs up the wall or just legs up. And they looked how interocular pressure changed, and it changed significantly in the glaucoma patients as well as in the healthy controls. So that's like the main finding. If you actually know that you are suffering from such a disease, it's really the change in intraocular pressure or the rise in intraocular pressure is really significant. Good news is it's also going back after 2 minutes, and the change wasn't different in the healthy controls versus the patients, but it does go up. And that's, in the yoga context, the only study I know that had specifically looked at that. But it might be of help if you want to have some solid evidence for that one. And as there's not so many yoga studies out there that are taking specific conditions like them under view, I just thought I wanted to share that one because I think it's like one of the things that we have more presently at mind when we think about the eyes and yoga, at least from my experience. I don't know if you agree or if that has come up when you have been talking about vision in your context as well.
Yeah. I just, in all the teacher trainings that I've not only been a student in, but as I've offered, it's good to hear the research back it up, because we just, some of this information just gets passed down from teacher to trainees, and we just say, oh, here's a contraindication, but there's good to know, like, that it's explored and examined in a way systematically. And that just makes me feel more confident in offering that contraindication if I am going to teach an inversion to someone that might be having one of those conditions. So yeah, it's good.
And again, I mean, we're not medical professionals, at least I'm not, and we're not, this is not medical advice of any sort, and it's also not meant to scare you if you're a teacher. It's just on this podcast and generally at Yoga Medicine, we just love to combine the knowledge that's out there, the science that's out there, with our practice and with the history of it all, and we just love to share that, and that's why we will also include that one in the show notes. Yeah. Any other aspects of vision or visual system that you would want to share to finish this conversation up?
Well, I think the last thing I'll say, which is just something that kind of popped into my mind that we didn't really talk about, but we can maybe leave the listener into considering, but like, how does our intention, our vision of what we're seeking in the future, or things that we'd like to bring into our life, like, how does our inner vision relate to that? And maybe the same things that we talked about, like, where am I hardening my inner vision around what my intention is for things to come, and where can I soften that? Or maybe I need more focus in terms of my inner vision if things aren't going the way that I'm, hoping that they go. And so I think that our vision as a sense and a perception and as a function of our nervous system is super fascinating. And then also, like, the capacity as human beings to have an inner vision and an intention, and where that can take us, and the power of how visualizing could potentially move you in different directions in your life. So I'll just put that out there to think about.
I totally love that. I love the thought of having a reflexive practice that speaks to that external sight and vision, to maybe the interpretations and inferences we have about that one, to become aware about the guess we make about the world with our visual system, and to question that one every once in a while, and also to be reflective about what our expectations on our inner vision and our vision internally, and imagination about the world in general, what that holds. I think it goes both ways, right? And we sometimes say in yoga, how you are acting on the mat, you might be bringing that out into the world. And I think that's also like a parable or a nice image for that one as well. How we look out into the world and how we look inward and reflect on our vision, our internal vision, is a very nice practice. And I love that you're bringing that up as a final thought. And I think that's just perfect to end this conversation. So thank you, Diane, for all your knowledge, for all your outlooks and practical recommendations on this topic. We love to have you again. And of course, hope to have you soon again in the future. And for all of those listening, thanks for joining and hope to have you on here soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you get something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.